Module 1. What climate finance actually is. Imagine a district in the north of your country. There's a plan on the table for a solar mini-grid, enough to bring reliable power to a few thousand households who have never had it. Everyone agrees it's a good idea. It cuts emissions, it builds resilience, it changes lives. And yet, year after year, it doesn't get built. The money doesn't show up. Why? That gap between a good climate idea and the money that would make it real is what this entire course is about. By the end of this module, you'll understand 3 things. First, what climate finance actually means and why it's a slippery term. Second, why the money for climate action doesn't flow on its own, the way money flows toward, say, a new shopping mall. And third, the long history of broken and rebuilt trust between rich and poor countries that sits underneath every negotiation you'll ever be part of. Let's start with the definition because it's messier than you'd expect. At its simplest, climate finance is money used to reduce greenhouse gas emissions or to help people adapt to the impacts of climate change. That's it. Money for mitigation, which means cutting or avoiding emissions, and money for adaptation, which means adjusting to the warming that's already locked in. A wind farm is mitigation. A seawall is adaptation. Both, when funded, count as climate finance. But here's where it gets slippery. Who decides what counts? If a government builds a road and adds slightly better drainage so it survives heavier rains, is the whole road climate finance, or just the drainage? If a bank makes an ordinary loan to a company that happens to sell electric buses, does that count? Different institutions answer these questions differently, which is why you'll see wildly different numbers for how much climate finance exists in the world. There's no single referee. Keep that in mind whenever someone quotes you a precise figure. Behind it is a choice about what to count. Now, the more interesting question. Why doesn't this money flow on its own? In a normal market, if something is profitable, money finds it. Investors are constantly hunting for returns. So if climate projects were straightforwardly profitable, we wouldn't need a whole field called climate finance, we'd just have finance. The very existence of this field is a signal that something in the ordinary machinery is broken, and there are 3 main reasons for that breakdown. The first reason is what economists call an externality. When a factory pollutes, the damage, the dirty air, the warming is paid for by everyone, not by the factory. The cost is external to the people making the decision. Flip that around. When someone reduces emissions, the benefit, a cooler planet, is spread across all of humanity and far into the future, but the cost is paid right now by one investor. So the person doing the good thing captures only a sliver of the value they create. That's a terrible deal, and markets systematically underinvest in it. Cutting carbon is good for the world, but often not, on its own, good for the balance sheet of the one paying for it. The second reason is timing and risk, especially in developing countries. Many climate projects, a solar plant, a restored mangrove, a resilient irrigation scheme, cost a lot upfront and pay back slowly over many years. Investors dislike waiting, and they especially dislike waiting in a place they perceive as risky, where the currency might swing, the government might change the rules, or the project might simply be new and untested. We'll spend all of Module 2 on exactly why this makes projects look unattractive on paper. For now, just hold the intuition. The benefits are long-term and diffuse, the costs are upfront and concentrated, and the risk feels high. And notice how cruelly circular this is. The countries most exposed to climate impacts are often the ones investors deem riskiest, so they're charged the most for money, so the very projects meant to protect them are the hardest to fund. The place that most needs the seawall is the place where the seawall is most expensive to finance. That circularity sits at the heart of the fairness argument, and it's worth carrying with you. The third reason is that a lot of climate action, adaptation especially, produces no revenue at all. A seawall doesn't sell tickets. An early warning system for floods doesn't send anyone a bill. These are public goods, things that benefit a whole community whether or not each person pays. And private money, by its nature, chases things that generate a paying customer. So the most essential climate work is often the least investable. This is a theme we'll return to again and again. Let me give you a sense of just how large this gap is, because the scale is the whole reason the field exists. Take adaptation alone in developing countries. The United Nations Environment Program, in its Adaptation Gap Report of 2024, estimated that developing countries' adaptation needs run somewhere between about $187 billion and $359 billion every single year this decade. And against that need, the international public money actually flowing for adaptation in 2022 was only about $28 billion. Sit with those two numbers for a moment. Hundreds of billions needed, tens of billions delivered. That chasm, the distance between what's required to keep people safe and what actually arrives, is not a rounding error. It's the central fact of your working life. And notice, it's largest exactly where the market is weakest, in adaptation, where there's no revenue to attract private money. The failure of ordinary finance and the size of the gap are the same story, told twice. Let me pause here because I suspect you have a question forming. If climate projects don't pay for themselves, isn't this just aid? Why call it finance at all, rather than just charity or development assistance? That's exactly the right instinct, and the honest answer is that it's a spectrum, not a clean category. Some climate finance really is grant money, a gift, closer to what you'd call aid. But a great deal of it is loans that must be repaid or investments that expect a return. The word finance is doing real work here. It signals that much of this money comes with terms, with interest, with expectations, and that a big part of the strategy is to use a little public or donor money to unlock much larger private money. So it lives in the space between charity and pure commercial investment. Learning to see where any given pot of money sits on that spectrum is one of the most useful skills you'll gain from this course, and it's the whole subject of Module 3. Good, now let's turn to the part that shapes every negotiation, the history, because climate finance isn't just a technical field. It's the site of a decades-long argument about fairness between the countries that got rich by burning carbon and the countries now living with the consequences. Let me give you that history as a single arc, because once you hear it as a story, the politics you encounter will make far more sense. It begins in Rio de Janeiro in 1992 at the Earth Summit. That's where countries signed the Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, the treaty that still governs all of this. And built into it from the start was a principle with a clunky name, common but differentiated responsibilities. In plain terms, everyone shares the problem, but the rich, industrialized countries, having caused most of the historical emissions, carry more of the responsibility, including the responsibility to help pay. That principle is the moral spine of the whole system, and you'll feel it in the room whenever finance is discussed. Next comes Kyoto, in 1997, the Kyoto Protocol. This was the first agreement to put binding emission cut targets on developed countries. For our purposes, its lasting legacy is that it created the first real carbon markets, mechanisms to let emission reductions be bought and sold across borders. We'll get deep into carbon markets in Module 13. Just note the seed was planted here. Then comes the moment that defines the trust story, Copenhagen, in 2009. The summit itself was widely seen as a chaotic failure, but out of it came a single, enormously important promise. Developed countries pledged to mobilize $100 billion a year by 2020 to help developing countries with climate action. $100 billion a year. That number became a symbol. It became the yardstick by which poor countries measured whether the rich ones were serious. And here's the painful part. The goal was missed in 2020. It was missed again in 2021. It was finally met in 2022, when about $115.9 billion was reported, according to the OECD, whose figures came out in May of 2024. So it was met, but 2 years late, and only confirmed 4 years after the deadline. Now, put yourself in the shoes of a negotiator from a vulnerable country. A promise was made, it was central, and it was broken for years. Every conversation about new money since then happens in the shadow of that broken promise. When you hear developing country delegates express deep distrust of new pledges, this is why. The $100 billion goal is the historical anchor of trust and distrust between rich and poor countries. Hold on to it. Then Paris, in 2015, the Paris Agreement, the one you know best. Its genius was to make the effort universal, every country puts forward its own plan, and to set the long-term temperature goals. On finance, Paris reaffirmed that developed countries should provide support and set the stage for a new, bigger goal to eventually replace the $100 billion. Paris also, quietly, did something else that matters for finance. It named 3 streams of effort, not 2. Alongside mitigation and adaptation, it acknowledged loss and damage, the harms that are already too severe to adapt to, the village that floods and cannot be rebuilt in place. For years, that third stream had no money attached to it at all, only argument. We'll see in a moment that this has finally begun to change, because it tells you the frontier of the whole field is still moving. I want you to notice something about this arc as a whole, because it's easy to miss when you're inside a single negotiation. Every one of these moments, Rio, Kyoto, Copenhagen, Paris, was a step in a slow expansion of what rich countries acknowledged they owed, from a vague principle to binding targets to a hard dollar figure, to eventually money for harms that can't be undone. Progress has been real. But at every step, the money agreed has lagged behind the responsibility acknowledged and lagged behind the need on the ground. That lag, that permanent gap between what's owed, what's promised, and what's paid, is the texture of this field. If you feel it as frustrating, you're feeling it correctly. Which brings us to the present. That new goal arrived at COP29 in Baku in November of 2024. It's called the New Collective Quantified Goal, or NCQG. And it says developed countries should take the lead in mobilizing at least $300 billion a year by 2035 for developing countries. That sits inside a broader call to scale up climate finance to $1.3 trillion a year by 2035, from all sources, public and private combined. We'll unpack exactly what those two numbers mean and why they're different in Module 4. For now, know this. Developing countries widely criticize the $300 billion as too low and too slow, so the trust story continues. A new number, a new argument about whether it's enough. These numbers keep climbing, 100 billion, 300 billion, 1.3 trillion. Where do such enormous figures even come from? Are they just made up? They're not made up, but they're not precise science either. They come from estimates of what it would actually cost to cut emissions fast enough and to adapt to the impacts in developing countries, added up across sectors, energy, transport, agriculture, coastal protection, and so on. Analysts build these bottom-up cost estimates, and the trillion-plus figures reflect the genuine scale of the need. The gap between what's needed and what's pledged is the entire tension of this field. The $300 billion is roughly what donors were willing to commit as public and mobilized money. The $1.3 trillion is closer to what studies say is actually required. That distance, between the willing and the needed, is where you and your work live. Before we close, let me nail down 2 distinctions cleanly, because you'll use them in every module that follows. The first is mitigation finance versus adaptation finance. Mitigation finance pays to cut or avoid emissions, solar, wind, clean transport, forests kept standing. Adaptation finance pays to cope with impacts already coming, flood defenses, drought-resistant crops, early warning systems. Here's the crucial imbalance, and you feel it in your daily work. Mitigation attracts far more money because it often has a product to sell, electricity, carbon credits. Adaptation is chronically starved because it usually doesn't. You saw the numbers a moment ago, hundreds of billions needed for adaptation against tens of billions delivered. Most of the world's climate money, by a wide margin, goes to mitigation, and most of that to energy, because that's where the market can be made to work. The projects closest to your own expertise, protecting communities from impacts they didn't cause, are precisely the projects the money reaches last. We'll devote a full module to that in justice. The second distinction is public versus private finance. Public finance is money from governments, from aid budgets, from the development banks that governments own. Private finance is money from commercial banks, from companies, from big investors like pension funds. The central dream of modern climate finance, and it's a contested dream, is to use limited public money to pull in much larger private money. You'll hear it called billions to trillions. Public billions, meant to unlock private trillions. Whether that actually works is one of the great debates of the field, and we'll test it honestly in Module 3 and again at the very end. One last nuance on that pairing, because it saves you from a common confusion. Public and private money don't just come in different amounts, they want different things. Private money must, by law and by duty, earn a return for whoever it belongs to. A pension fund cannot gamble a retiree's savings on a project that won't pay them back. Public money can accept a lower return or no return or even a deliberate loss because its purpose is a public good, not a profit. That single difference in what each kind of money is allowed to want explains almost everything about how they behave, and why the whole system spends so much energy trying to make public and private money work together in the same deal. Keep that in your pocket, it will unlock a lot. So, to bring it together, climate finance is money for cutting emissions or adapting to impacts, and its very existence tells you the ordinary market has failed to fund these things on its own. For 3 reasons: the benefits are shared while the costs are concentrated, the risks and timelines scare private money away, and much of the work produces no revenue at all. Underneath the technical field runs a long story of trust, from Rio's principle of differentiated responsibility, through Kyoto and Copenhagen's fateful 100 billion promise, to Paris and now the new 300 billion goal set in Baku. And 2 distinctions will follow you everywhere: mitigation versus adaptation, and public versus private. You now know what climate finance is and why it's hard. But to really understand why a good project can look bad on paper, you need the finance basics themselves, and that's exactly where we go next.